Welcome to the Polgar Chess University. In this lesson, I would like to focus on some endgames, bishop versus knight. Let me start with this position. Well, what is the first thing to notice here? It is that while white is an extra pawn up, at the same time, even if black would lose the knight on f3, the game may end in a draw because the white bishop is of an opposite color from the potential promotion square of the white rook pawn. However, the situation is not quite that simple. Also, the black king needs to arrive to the corner. If white manages to win the knight without the black king arriving to the corner to at least one of these 4 squares, then black still will lose the game. Black has more than one way to draw the game here, but the most effective and brilliant way to accomplish that is to move the knight to e5. While at first it seems that this is a silly move, as the white king can simply capture that, understanding the fact that after king moves to g7, black accomplished the goal. Once the king gets to one of these 4 squares that I pointed out a minute ago, there is no way to chase the black king out from the corner or the 3 squares surrounding it. The best white can accomplish is stalemate. And then, of course, the game is still a draw. Now, let's check out what happens if white is trickier than that and does not capture the knight for now. Of course, advancing the pawn does not accomplish white's goal because it allows an immediate check which forks the white king and the pawn, followed by simply knight takes pawn, even if the king would be able to recapture after that. However, the trickiest move now is bishop to e6, still not allowing the black king to run to the corner, and seemingly keeping the black knight away from all these squares. However, that is only the appearance, which is not quite the case. In fact, any of those 3 knight moves are sufficient to save the game. Of course, after a check like this, the white bishop can capture the knight on g4. However, that would at the same time result in allowing the black king to run towards the corner and achieve a simple theoretical draw. However, again, the nicest and most effective move is to move the knight to f7, using the idea that if bishop takes knight right now, that would be a stalemate. In the meantime, the knight also holds off the advancement of white's pawn and immediately threatens for the king to get to the corner. And there's nothing that white can do about it. As I said, if bishop takes knight, it's stalemate, and on any other move, the black king can simply walk onto the corner and reach the theoretical draw. Let me show you an example from my own practice when I played the New Zealandic Grandmaster Murray Chandler at the famous traditional Bill tournament a good number of years ago and reached this position. This is a very difficult position for black. Obviously, white has 2 extra pawns. Unfortunately, I was on the black side of the game, and I figured I'll make a tricky move, but there is no chance that my opponent would fall for it. Luckily for me, my opponent had a careless moment and quickly captured my knight, understanding that after king takes pawn, the white king would move to f6, not allowing my king getting back to the corner. What he has forgotten about is that I can still move to the corner with my king, leaving white 2 rook pawns and still resulting in a drawn endgame. Remember that even if white has 3 more pawns lined up or 4 more pawns lined up on the H file, the position is still a draw. There is still no way to chase the king out of the corner, and therefore white cannot make any progress. I have to say that was one of my luckier games, but those things can happen to anyone. Of course, to grandmasters, it happens not that often. Let's move on to a different topic, different subject. Still, of course, bishop versus knight. In this position, white seems to have an ideal situation, cutting black's knight out of the game. However, the situation is not that easy at all because white is about to lose the pawn on e7. For example, if white would right now play king g3, the simplest way to achieve a draw for black is to give up on the knight, and after king takes knight, grab white's last existing pawn on e5, and of course, then it's a draw. But if not that, how can white possibly win? Well, white needs to go the other way, king g5. Now, if king e7, white wins pretty simply, as after king f5, the white bishop has this ideal positioning, totally paralyzing the black knight. And then the rest of the game would continue, ignoring for the time being the white bishop and the black knight. And just as if it would be a pawn endgame, white would simply advance the pawn, and because that promotion square is of the same color as white bishop, then of course the checkmate would arrive. But let's move on to the more interesting variation. After king g5, what if the black knight moves now to g4? If bishop takes knight, pawn takes back, the pawn endgame is a draw. Now, of course, there is no more bishop and knight, and therefore this is a simple draw. So, after king g5 and knight g4, so what else may white try here? Well, naturally, capturing the black pawn on f5. But now, what if knight takes pawn? And if king takes knight, obviously, white loses the very last pawn. And here comes the beautiful move. Look at that. The king moves to e6, lining all the pieces that are left on the board on the same file. What a brilliant, beautiful move. And white now threatens to attack the black king from either side. What a beautiful harmony in the position. And it's not hard to figure out that any black move would still allow a checkmate here. A beautiful composition by the composer Seleznev. As you notice in these type of endgames, as we just saw, the pawn is most important because king and bishop does not win against the king. So you definitely want to make sure you keep at least one of your pawns because that's the only potential to possibly win the game. Let's move on to a different type of endgame. Here we go. Well, let's see this endgame. Here white has the knight, black has the bishop, and what we see is that the pawns are pretty much locked up. That's for one. And just as importantly, you need to notice that all the pawns that black have are on the same color of their bishop. Typically, especially in endgames, of course also oftentimes in middle game, that's a serious problem because on one hand, it restricts the mobility of the bishop. And as we see here right now, the white pawns at the same time are on opposite colors from black's bishop, which means that the black bishop has no potential to ever attack those pawns. In this type of situations, the knight is clearly better than the bishop because the knight indeed can attack the black pieces, the black pawns, while black has totally no counterplay. Also, the white king is much more active than its counterpart. The white king is being on the offensive, attacking the pawn on f7, while black is on defense. After understanding all of that, of course, the remaining question is, how can white make progress? Typically, when there is a pawn chain, like we see here, we should look for ways how to attack the base of the pawn chain. And what's the base? The f7 pawn. The knight already was attacking the other pawns, but that didn't mean much, since those pawns were protected by another pawn. It's not so simple to get to this f7 pawn a second time. Obviously, the white knight cannot go to h3, which would be a natural way to try to get to g5. In addition to that, white needs to make sure that even after white would successfully attack the pawn, the black bishop would have no way to simply protect it. I suggest you try to pause the recording for a few minutes and try to play around and figure out on your own how can white make progress here and win that f7 pawn. Of course, if white succeeds and black's pawn from f7 is gone, that means that the pawn on f6 will become a passed pawn and will be able to promote shortly after. The first move is a quiet move, kind of putting black in a zugzwang situation. Now, if the black bishop moves on this diagonal, for example to e4, that would allow white to capture the pawn on e6, as the pawn is already so far advanced that it would get promoted real soon. If after king g8, on the other hand, the bishop remains on the other diagonal and moves to g4, hanging on to the pawn on e6 and still not allowing the knight to go to h3, then there is a beautiful move still using that same idea, and the knight moves to g6, because now if pawn takes, then the f-pawn is free to go. Black responded with bishop d1, and now an unusual move, moving the knight to the corner, but we finally attack the pawn. Hey, but wait a minute, bishop comes back and protects. What did we really achieve? We trapped our own knight, didn't we? It seems so, but it is not so. White has only one good move, but that's good enough to win. Simply move the king back to g7, and this would put black in zugzwang, meaning that if either the king moves away, the pawn is lost, and the same happens if the bishop moves away anywhere along the diagonal. And therefore, black lost. Let's move on to our next example. Here we go. Again, the situation is kind of similar in the fact that most of the black pawns are blocked up on the same color squares as black bishop is. Well, by seeing these examples, hopefully you remember the message. Try not to get into a situation where you only have one bishop that's on the same color when all your pawns are, especially not if they are blocked up, like in this case, that the black bishop has no target on the queen side, while the white knight has a potential to attack the black pawns. Just like in the previous example, in addition to the white knight aiming to attack the base of the pawn chain, which cannot be protected by another pawn, because white has a far advanced pawn on c6, again there are tactics available that could create a passed pawn along the c file. In this game, white continued with a knight maneuver, moving the knight to b2. Black moves his bishop, and the knight moved to d3 with the simple idea of trying to move to f4 and e6 and then capturing the pawn. Black was trying to prevent that and played bishop d2. Now it would be a suicidal idea for white to continue with the plan, because all of a sudden bishop would trade and the resulting pawn endgame would favor black actually, because black would have an outside passed pawn that would be used as a bait for the white king, and then black would capture the white pawns one after another. Let's go back to the moment before white would have played knight f4, and here try to think for a moment and see how white should continue instead of the mistaken knight f4. And here the answer is the brilliant knight c5. The knight still aims to go to e6 to go after the pawn on c7, but thanks to the fact that white can break through and create a passed pawn on the queen's side after either pawn capture, this is a winning move. The game continued, white takes, and then b6, and white simply created a passed pawn, and it is game over for black. The white pawn on c7 is unstoppable. Let's move on to our next example, another knight versus bishop endgame. In this position, things look quite good for white. White has two far advanced passed pawns. However, they are blockaded for the moment with the black king being right in between the two, and also the black bishop is on that same diagonal holding the pawns off. In addition, black also has a passed pawn on d3. Try to think and see what you should do. Obviously, the idea should be to either promote the pawn without the new queen being captured, or in some cases, since the black king is pretty much in the corner, it may be actually to look for some checkmate ideas. The first most natural move to look at is to play knight d6 right now. Now black is very limited in responses. In fact, there is only one reasonable move, moving back to the corner, otherwise the white pawn would simply promote. And now, as I mentioned, in addition to trying to promote one of the white pawns, white can try to play for checkmate. The black king is completely cornered if white only could get his knight to c7. Of course, black can try to stop that idea. Black continues by advancing the pawn. The black pawn is about to get promoted. Knight e8. And now, of course, if pawn promotes, we're ready to checkmate. But here is the problem. What if the bishop checks first? And only after king moves out, then promotes. Wow, is black winning now? Not quite. That's when calculation is important to foresee that white has a check, and then not only promoting the pawn, but immediately announcing checkmate. Very beautiful game, and this is not a composition. It has been played in a real game in the Ukraine in 1992. Let's see our next example. Here we go. This, on the other hand, is a composition, but it's a very important pattern that I suggest you remember and try to look for in your own games. Bishops are amazing long-range pieces, and for example, in this position, if white would simply advance the pawn, the bishop would show up immediately on h5, stopping the advancement of the pawn and in fact trapping white's knight in the corner. Black would be likely to win here. On the other hand, white can be smarter than that and block up the diagonals of the black bishop, which would result in stopping the promotion of the pawn. Again, I suggest you take your time, take 5 to 10 minutes, and try to figure out the correct sequence for white to win this game. And the solution is to first give up this pawn. The story here is that really white's goal is to make sure the most advanced pawn, the e6 pawn, promotes. And therefore, even if the cost is to lose the other pawn and the knight, that's fine, as long as that one pawn gets through. Pawn takes, and now knight g6. How amazing is that? And if pawn takes, e7, and neither bishop a4 or h5 help anymore in stopping the pawn promotion. But this is not all. After knight g6, black can be trickier than that and play king g4. Now this is getting exciting. If knight e5, then king f5, e7, and the bishop still catches the pawn. That's not the answer. After b5 and pawn takes and knight g6, king g4, e7. That's it, right? Pawn gets promoted. Not so quickly. Black can check and appear still on this diagonal. Unluckily for black, white is ready to fork. When you see knights around on the board, always look out for forking possibilities. A beautiful endgame. And here is our last example in this lesson, composed by Troitsky in 1910. In this position, the white knight is under attack, and the other problem is that black's d-pawn is quite close to the promotion square. For example, if white would just move the knight away to a random square like d7, black would immediately advance the pawn, and the knight has no way in catching the pawn. Although white has a tricky move, such as knight f6, but that would be a big mistake, not because of d2, which would allow check and then fork, winning the pawn on d2, but after knight d7, d3, knight f6, black has much better move, first a check, and then advancing the pawn, and white is lost. Let's go back to the beginning position and see what is the correct solution. It's an amazing fortress that white will be able to create. First move, knight c6, attacking black's bishop. If the bishop now moves, then the knight can simply catch the pawn on b4 or perhaps even capture the pawn and then play g4, trading off black's last pawn. But what happens if black's pawn now advances, giving up on the bishop, and then advances again? Looks pretty hopeless, doesn't it? And here comes the amazing part. Knight b5, allowing the pawn to promote, and another quiet move, knight c3. Now the black queen can go anywhere it wants, in fact, even with a check. And the king simply moves out to the corner. And it's black's turn. Black is up a queen for only a knight and pawn. Amazingly enough, black has no check. And after any queen move, the white knight will simply arrive to e4, and black has no way to make progress. The king is stuck on h4, and the game is a draw. Of course, it's important to understand that the black king cannot get out of that bind because that would allow the fork. Therefore, this position is a draw. I hope you enjoyed this last position, which was the jewel of the week. Thank you for listening. I hope I gave you some ideas for knight versus bishop endgames. See you back next week. Thank you. Bye-bye.